Could it be time to see things just a little differently and get a fresh perspective to find creative solutions? In this episode of the League of Visionaries podcast, we talk to David Chislett, change pilot and an opening speaker at the PSA 2024 convention, on creativity, why it's so important, and how to make it happen for you. Welcome to the League of Visionaries podcast, where we meet experts, entrepreneurs, and enthusiasts with a visionary message to share. This podcast is brought to you by Yazi Media Virtual Media House. Yazi Media is a proud media partner of the PSA Convention 2024. We dedicate this second season of the podcast to the speakers and other visionaries behind this premier event for the speaking community. I'm your host, Marie Leroux, and this is the League of Visionaries podcast. David Chislett, you're known as the change pilot. You speak about creativity and you live it and you breathe it. It comes all the way through your brand. You are based in Europe at the moment. You said you're in outside a little town outside Utrecht.
Yeah.
And we are getting your creative vibes all across the planet. We're so delighted that we'll be seeing you at the PSA Convention 2024. Welcome to the League of Visionaries podcast.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
David, creativity is a big deal. It's the thing you speak about.
Yeah.
But maybe we're not taking creativity and maybe even fun seriously enough. Why is it so important?
Well, I think the biggest issue is that creativity has been stuffed into a little silo, which is mainly labeled art, which is not serious enough for adults. And the problem with that is that it's a completely artificial division. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what creativity actually is and what it does. Because if you look at any successful business, Fortune 500 or what have you, what underpins the value that they have in a marketplace is a piece of intellectual property, a USP, right?
Mm-hmm.
And somewhere along the line, someone created that. And off the basis of that piece of IP, they then created a business and a value proposition. So if you insist that creativity is just art, you are denying yourself the ability to create new businesses, new processes, new solutions to old questions. And it's a completely artificial, societally driven divide. We are all creative, but we're not all creative in the same way, using the same skills, or in the same subject matter or materials. And that seems to be what gets people confused.
That is such a valuable insight to have, right? And it's like, it's a real divide and conquer situation because it leaves many of us feeling, I don't have the logic, or others feel I don't have the creativity. And in your work as a keynoter, as a trainer, as an author, as a prolific writer, and an all-round haver of fun, this is something that you really advocate is go out there, be creative. It matters. And at a time like this, it might matter more than ever because there's a strong temptation at the moment. The two big letters of the year, over the past year or two, has been AI.
Yeah.
What is the value of this authentic intelligence in the face of the artificial intelligence? Why does creativity matter with that?
All right. So first up, what we are currently calling AI is not AI. They are machine learning algorithms which can generate interesting connections based on what you feed it. What human beings do when they're creative is they jump across databases in order to find or make interesting connections. And they don't always need to have all the dots to actually make those connections. At the current level of iteration, AI just cannot do that. What that means is that the AI is super useful for plotting out connections that rationally or logically we haven't mapped out yet. But then what seems to be the most powerful use currently is for human beings then to use that platform to jump off, to make the creative leaps into unexpected connections, which reveals really new and different stuff. But that new stuff doesn't always need to be radical or unique or fundamentally disruptive. It just needs to be different enough that you and I and the rest of the public are prepared to actually deal with it,
Mhm.
um, but new enough that it does have a different outcome. Because if you're just completely random, completely new, it's way too intimidating for everybody.
And it might
So,
not have value.
right. I mean, there's a good reason why AI has taken so long to take off. The
Mhm.
technology has more or less been available for 20 years, but the whole idea was just too scary. But in the last 7 or 8 years, slowly all sorts of little machine learning tools have been drifting into the marketplace, and more people are now comfortable with the idea. And voila, we have ChatGPT.
And it's very exciting to see, since ChatGPT was almost like the person of the year of 2022. And we've actually evolved into this love-hate relationship with AI. It's lovely that it can do the things that it can do. And so many of us were very intimidated at the start
Yeah.
because everything it spits out is so perfect. And it's given us a new appreciation for imperfection. It's almost like
Well,
now when somebody makes a grammar mistake, or they're just like throwing a sentence because that's how they speak. I just go, yeah, that's you. That's real. That's we appreciate that. And finding the best of both worlds is a really exciting challenge.
yeah. Um, I have a problem with the word perfection, as you may have noticed.
Mm.
Um, Nothing is ever finished. And I think this is part of the problem that we have, is that we tend to look at everything outside there in the world as being discrete entities which coexist alongside each other.
Mm.
And if that was true, then indeed you would be able to have perfection, because you would come to the limits of your entity and that would be literally as good as it could get. Reality is more complicated. In fact, we seem to exist in a massive um, mess of interrelated, open-ended systems which have no clear borders. And if you see the world like that, you begin to realize that there can be no perfection. There can be no, real gurus or experts or ultimate expressions of things, because it's all part of something else as well as being what it is. And again, to get back to the AI theme, what machine taught algorithms can do is limited because it's a silo. It's a database or many databases that are fed to it.
Mm.
Anything that was not in the database, they're not capable of having anything to do with. So we're very far away from a general artificial intelligence, by which mostly we mean something that is conscious, self-aware.
Mm.
And, that's when things are going to get really spooky and different and challenging. AI right now is threatening because it's going to replace a whole bunch of people, because its ability in highly niched environments to be more accurate than a human being is extremely valuable.
Mm.
But like every piece of technology that has resulted in jobs being lost, ultimately it will replace those jobs with better jobs, with more highly skilled and better paid jobs. That's, if you look into the history of technological advances, that is what has happened. When the ATM was invented, millions of bank tellers were put out of work, and it
Mm.
was a big problem. Now there are more bank tellers in the world than ever before, and they are more highly qualified, doing more challenging, more interesting work, because the dog work has been taken over by the automated machine, leaving human beings to do what they do best and tackle the really complicated stuff.
Yes, this is exactly why we need you to be talking to us, to equip us with the tools to actually get more creative. And that is why I'd love to know more about this idea that you have branded yourself as the change pilot, and the
Hmm.
graphics behind it tell me there's also a bit of change pirate in there. And you've got this wonderful mantra of rebel, reject, create. Tell us more, David.
Yeah. Well, the change pilot idea is modeled on the notion of a harbor pilot, a friendly person who climbs on board and helps you get past all the obvious hurdles by, with their greater understanding of what's going on in those waters. And yes, somebody actually pointed out it looks a bit like Lemmy from Motorhead, my pirate holding onto the wheel. That was completely inadvertent, but I am a big believer in the pirate way of looking at things,
Mm,
because pirates were not scared to break the rules and reject the status quo. But what they did afterwards is what makes them really interesting, is because they then created their own social systems and their own sense of
mm,
justice and reward and equality and so on and so on. And that's also why it's no coincidence that my Rebel, Reject, Create mantra in its logo form is a pirate ship,
yes.
because it's, anybody can burn it all down. I mean, that's easy. But the question is, what do you burn down and what do you then build next?
Mm,
So a lot of people react to my Rebel, Reject, Create as if it's a nihilistic, anarchic cry to destroy everything. And it's not really. What it is, it's an appeal to self-awareness. It's about rebelling against the rules, what's being imposed on you from outside, whilst at the same time rejecting your own assumptions and your programming and your cognitive bias, basically.
mm,
Because when you do that, and only once you've done that, will you step into a space where there's enough ambiguity and openness and complexity where you can actually create new answers and do things differently. And if you look at what's happening at the world right now, we clearly need new answers. We need new socio-political answers. We need new environmental answers. We need new ways to think about our food and our water and how we are who we are. We need new ways to think about doing business and about globalization and international travel. But because the dominant narrative of our civilization is hyper-rational, rule-based, and pattern-driven, we're struggling to break out of the loop.
mm.
We need to think differently, and that means we need to break all of those rules. It doesn't mean we need to burn the whole thing down, but we need to break the rules to get out of the mental loop. And only when we've done that, when enough of us have done that, will it become obvious and apparent what can be done next.
That's really exciting. And now you speak about the situation that we're all together in the same boat, maybe not even a pirate ship in the world. And there's a lot that needs to be burned down. The way that things are with the world right now, leadership, business, the economy, even our climate. There's a great deal of nature that's now been so turned upside down that it's really hard to see what actually still serves us, and we don't all agree. So,
Yeah,
just to add more to the fun,
yeah,
you have spoken about how uh, creativity actually feeds into very different areas of life, specifically ourselves, the world of business, and the environment. Would you
yeah,
speak to that?
yeah, sure. You know, the thing that I've realized through my own personal experience as a poet, as a musician, as a performer, as a writer, is that my ability to harness my creativity through my particular skill set has given me meaning and purpose,
Mm,
which has allowed me to extract fulfillment from my life and has put me in a position where I can do pretty much whatever the hell I want. And I think it's no coincidence that many people do not feel like they have purpose or
mm,
meaning, because they do not feel like they are in control of their own ship. They are not the pilot. They are a passenger.
mm,
And what creativity does is it gives you permission to think differently and to say, well, I don't like this. What if? And then you jump into imaginative thinking. What if I didn't do this? What if I did something else? What would that look like? What would I
mm,
need to change? What if I had $1 million? What would I do? Why would I do that? Why is that even important? How would I get there? I would need to do this. I'd need to do this. I'd need to do that. Oh, okay. I can do those things. Right. I'm off. You know,
mm.
that's why creativity is so powerful for individuals. When you give yourself permission to slip the shackles of what is and think creatively and imaginatively about what could be, you always run the risk of realizing that actually it can. You just need to change your behavior or learn a new
Mm.
skill, and there you have it. So that's critically important. When you translate that into organizations, you begin to see that a lot of organizations are basically losing the intellectual capital of their people because it's all KPIs, KPAs, and rules and ticking the boxes and staying within the lines and not rocking the boat. What that does is deliver efficiency across the board on a given range of variables.
Mm-hmm.
But those variables are no longer in the given range. And in fact, they are shifting further and faster than ever in human history. And when you have a bunch of individuals who are not empowered to ask what if and to behave differently, you're going to end up with companies tanking faster than ever in history. And if you look at the Nielsen reports, you will see that the average lifespan of big corporates has dropped from something like 60 years to under 10 in the last 50 years. So as an organization, you cannot afford to not be creative. You need creative thinkers now more than ever before in history, because you do not live in a static world.
That says everything that needs saying.
The PSA-SA Convention 2024 is Africa's premier event for professional speakers. Whether you are already an established speaker, you're finding your feet, or you are aspiring to starting a professional speaking career, this is your opportunity to learn from the best. Connect with professional speakers from across Southern Africa, Africa, and the globe. Book your spot while they're still available on the PSA-SA website at psasouthernafrica.co.za or scan the QR code on your screen. And now, back to our guest, PSA-SA Convention 2024 speaker, David Chislett, on creativity.
That takes us through the business environment. How does this translate into the environmental challenges that we're facing today? And how can creativity help us, especially when many of us are struggling to see a united goal? Thinking of things like pollution, carbon emissions is a great example. We've had the developed countries saying, well, it's time to cut down on the carbon emissions, and many developing countries are saying, but we haven't had a turn to play yet.
Yeah.
When actually the opportunity may be to leapfrog and bypass a lot of the destructive things that have happened. How do you see creativity playing into the environment?
Well, for a start, in upending what you just said, because actually it's the developed nations that are the biggest polluters who are being the slowest to change, and it's the emerging nations that are, without doubt, the lowest emitters who already have those bypassing factors in play. Of course, there are exceptions. And this is the problem. We just buy that. We just buy that discourse. Yeah, of course, the civilized world is doing the right thing. We're not. By far and away, the biggest polluters are the United States and China, like by an enormous percentage. And so, yes, it's a massive opportunity for emerging economies to go green in a meaningful way, because what that means is they can hijack that position of superiority of the established markets in a way that has not been available for some time. You know, by point of example, the ATM was invented in South Africa. Why?
Right.
Because we didn't have to worry about all of the historical employment issues that Europe and the Northern Americas had to worry about. And it was easier for us to experiment and create a different alternative. So we just skipped to step or five. And I can see that happening in the future. But when I talk about the environment, I'm not just talking about what we now generally refer to as the environment, about nature and pollution and global warming and all that stuff. I'm talking about everything that exists outside of your head and outside of your body. These are all radically important, because in order to be creatively empowered, you need to enjoy psychological safety. You need to be engaged in an open and safe environment where you can actually have conflict without it escalating into fights. You need to be in an environment which is pleasant, which is stimulating, which is inspiring. Doesn't sound at all like a cubicle office in an average high-rise. And because when you start to think about how important everything that happens around you is to everything that you do, that's when you end up in the environment macro.
Mm.
And at this point in time, I don't think it matters whether we can agree that what is happening to the climate is man-made or some part of a historical cycle. What does matter is that it's happening. And that if we do not take steps to change the way we operate, things are going to go badly south and fast. And so I don't care about consensus as to why what is happening is happening. I think it's very clear if you just look at any chart, the temperatures are rising, sea levels are rising, acidity in the oceans is rising, and so on and so on. And we need to be prepared for that. We need to have other solutions in place. And that's all that matters. And so in order to get to that kind of thinking, what we need to let go of is our addiction to short-term returns, to quarterly profits for shareholders who are not in any way invested in what happens in that company, except that it makes the money this quarter. And the second it doesn't, they dump their shares and go somewhere else that will. That's got to stop, because that's not helping anybody think long-term.
Yes.
And if we can change that perspective, maybe then it'll be more acceptable for businesses to be thinking, well, in 50 years, I want my company still to be here and to be profitable, which means we can't actually be polluting like crazy, because given the fact that some kind of climate change is underway, that's just going to contribute to the problem, and it's all going to come to a grinding halt sooner or later. So let me change now so that in 15, 20 years, this company still exists. But no one's thinking like that. It's all about shareholder profit now. It's got to change.
There just seems to be too little awareness that altruism can be self-interested. We're not aware enough on a collective scale that if we continue what we're doing, eventually it's going to shoot us in the foot.
Yeah.
So there's something very radical about what you're saying. Radical in that it really looks at the root of what we're looking towards. So I definitely see your rebel, reject, create philosophy cutting into that as well. Like, go and look at the assumptions, go and look at not even the facts, but what we're believing are the facts, and ask, is it a fact?
Yeah. I mean, I love that Einstein quote, the definition of madness, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. I mean, that
Absolutely.
pretty much describes what's going on in business and manufacturing and mining right now. You know, that's what all the oil companies are doing. They're doubling down. Everyone wants to drill more oil this year. Why? Oh, because we can make record profits. So yeah, it is radical, but it's also actually deeply conservative. It's, if you think about it, what it is, it's about self-preservation. It's about long-term self-interest. And, you know, psychology will tell you that human beings are really bad with long-term self-interest, weirdly enough. We're very good with short-term self-interest, immediate survival. We're pretty damn bad at thinking about what's going to be good for us in 10 years' time.
I'm
And
thinking
we
of
all
the
know
famous
this.
marshmallow test, right?
Right.
If you can wait for the marshmallows, you can have two later, or you
Yeah.
can have one now. And how many of us just go for the one marshmallow now? And it's
Right.
interesting because I think, being a really kind of greedy person by nature who likes marshmallows, I'm always in for, I'll wait for the marshmallows. But when it comes to real life, it's not quite that simple. We don't always even see that there are going to be two marshmallows if we can be patient.
No. And that's kind of where we are. I think alternative energy has the potential for ultimately being free, which would set the vast majority of the global population free from the cycle of debt and poverty that they currently exist in. And if the vast majority of the population was free from poverty and debt, that means they could rise up through Maslow's pyramid of hierarchies and start thinking about bigger and deeper and existential things, which means the planet would have more intellectual capacity than ever before, which means we'd have more solutions to the problems that we face. It's not rocket science, it's basic maths. But we don't do that. We're more interested in the short-term reward. It's fascinating and a little bit scary.
It definitely is a little bit scary. It feels like a much too early time of the day to be having such a deep conversation. But I do want to ask you, David, about critical thinking, creative thinking. Where do the two meet? How does creativity inform the critical thinking? And why is critical thinking valuable to creative thinking?
Yeah. Whew. I think it's really important here to, again, iterate that creative thinking isn't only one kind of thinking.
Mm.
According to the foresight method of analyzing creative thinkers, there are at least 4 different types of creative thinkers, some of whom are about implementation, some of whom are about planning, and some of whom are about the fine details, and some of whom are about the big idea. We
Mm.
tend to fixate on creativity as being the big idea people, and we forget about the rest.
Mm.
Critical thinking is very often used by developers and by small detailed people in order to spot what's wrong. And then what they do is
Right.
they use that in order to come up with new solutions. So
Mm.
it's one end of the same piece of string, effectively. You know, when you learn something new, the mere act of physically learning something new is creative on a purely physical level. A
Yes.
new neuronic correct connection is made in your brain. Literally, a new physical structure emerges in your head. It's created.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so once you've learned something, you cannot unknow it. It will change your perspective forever.
Mm.
So again, that's growth, that's change, that's creativity. Uh, and then you get these people who say, I'm not creative because I can't hold a note, can't carry a tune, can't paint, can't dance, can't write. And it's like, no. The fact that you came up with that tells me that you are creative, because that's a pretty creative answer to not being creative.
Yes, you see. But
Right.
that's a beautiful definition or an awareness of creativity, really getting down to the root of the meaning and really seeing things are created as we learn, as we are in the process, and we are by definition creative creatures, no pun at all intended. That just came out.
If I ask you a question, Marie, what are you going to do?
I'm gonna go like ask me a question, David. Go ahead.
Right. You just answered my question. You couldn't help
Ah,
yourself.
right. That's a
You
bit
had to,
solipsistic.
right? You had to make something up. You
Yes,
felt completely compelled to say something
yes.
because you're a creative being. That's it.
Right. That is so profound because it's so easy to dismiss our own creativity because of the garbage that was pumped into our heads when we sat in schools on square desks being told that we need to, follow the rules and all of this. So there's a lot there for all of us to do.
You know, your grade 3 painting is not
Mm.
good enough because it's not realistic enough because you're not creative. It
Praise
doesn't
the
fit the template, so you're
Mm,
not creative. So
mm,
from that age, we're shamed out of it. I mean, when you
mm.
speak to people, at some stage, they start to get quite emotional about creativity and remembering what they were like when kids, mostly because we've been shamed out of it. So that's why people say they're not creative, because they're ashamed.
Yes.
And that's why when you try and get people to acknowledge creativity and that they are creative, they have immense difficulty with it because it's a deep rooted identity emotional issue.
Wow. How do we get over that? Because if you've got your limited time in a keynote or in a training,
Yeah.
how do you lure people out of their shame around creativity in a limited time?
Well, I mess with their heads, basically. We do all sorts of stuff that isn't creative, and they only figure out later that it is.
Yeah,
um,
that's a very good answer. So let's get to
yeah.
the Mohawks.
Mm.
Let's get down to business here, because doing a little bit of research about you, I was looking at so much of what you have done. And yes, when we look at what we have in our minds about what creative people do, you've pretty much run the whole gamut. You've done the whole Renaissance man routine. You've done music, poetry, books, speaking. And I see in one of your fantastic pictures, you're sitting there with what I think I would define as a mohawk, which I think is something that I might need at this point in my life because I'm considering having a midlife crisis. I'm not on the creative end where I'm kind of just going to let it happen. I do need to plan it. You have found a great deal of expression in things that we easily define as creativity. So you've spoken a bit about how this plays out for different people, how creative expression might not always be the bright colors and the music
Yeah,
and the dance and the writing and all of these things. For you, it has.
yeah,
How do you experience that as, yeah, as a creative outlet? And you've spoken a bit about how it gives you purpose.
yeah.
How can people find more purpose in the thing that does switch them on creatively?
Look, retrospectively, I'm lucky. My parents were incredibly hands-off. So I wasn't forced to be anything I didn't want to be. So, and as the youngest of 5 children, I had more than enough space. I was pretty invisible. I just did whatever the hell I wanted. Into that vacuum came a couple of incredibly influential teachers who saw something in me and nurtured me and encouraged me and gave me extra help and direction and pointers, which gave me the confidence to try the next thing and then the next thing and the next thing.
Mm.
To the point where I woke up one day and realized, well, this is what and who I am. So for me, it was never about stepping out the box, breaking the rules, making a statement, it was always just about following the paper trail, as it were, to a point. And only once I got to a certain point did I kind of look back and go, oh, look at that. I'm a this. Wow, that's interesting. How the hell did that happen?
Mm-hmm.
But once I'd done that, once I'd looked over my shoulder, I could then look into the future and project that track
Oh.
ahead of me and
Mm.
go, okay, all right, so that means I don't have to worry about all this stuff. I can just focus on this stuff. And
Mm.
that's when at the grand old age of 38, suddenly went, okay, I'm going to start publishing like
Right.
my own stuff, entirely my own stuff. And I'm going to do it myself. And I'm just going to go for it because I'm not doing this because I want to be a rock star, because I want to be a famous poet, because I'm doing this because this is who I am. This is what I do. And once I did that, then this purpose of helping other people discover that emerged.
Mm.
It was not a decision, a plan, a fait accompli. It was a process.
Mm.
And so if you don't just start, you will never discover what might happen next.
Mm.
And that's the key learning for me. That famous shoe brand's got it all wrong. It's not just do it, it's just start. Because that's what stops people from doing. They can't start.
Yes.
So if you can overcome your resistance to starting by letting go of your preconception about how it must end, then you can engage in a journey. But you got to start.
You gotta start. That is
Yeah.
beautiful. I think Goethe would agree with you. He said, whatever you can do or think you can, begin it. And then there's the vulnerability of
Mm.
sharing something like that out there.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that for yourself? Many of the visionaries listening to a show like this get out there and speak, they get out there and write, and they often tell me quietly in confidence, oh, it's so hard. It's so hard to share this stuff out there because as long as you don't share it, as long as you don't start, David, you don't start, nobody's going to criticize you.
Yeah.
Some might even feel sorry for you and pat you on the shoulder. But when you do start, there's stuff out there and it could get criticized. How do you
Yeah.
handle that?
I'm going to tell you a story.
Hmm.
Many years ago, I started sharing my poetry on Facebook. In fact, I got a little bit carried away because I am a little bit OCD, and I published a poem on Facebook every day for 18 months. One day, I published a poem that I was incredibly happy with. I thought it was powerful, technically sound, emotionally robust, and basically a really good piece of work.
Mm.
Crickets. Absolute silence. No likes, no comments, nothing. The next day, because I was a bit down after that experience, I threw up a totally random thing because I'd made this commitment to publishing something every day. And I got these reactions. Oh, that is just like, you're speaking to me where I am right now. That makes me think about this. This is so emotional. Oh, it's so brilliant. I love that metaphor. And a huge light bulb went off in my head. I went, my opinion of this worth of what I'm doing is irrelevant. What matters is how people experience it. That's what matters to them.
Mm.
And so me getting all tangled up in the criticism and the whys and the whats is actually doing nothing except hamstringing myself,
Mm.
because it's not about my opinion or me at all. It's all about the people who are interacting with it. And so I just let it go. I'm just like, well, I'm doing what I'm doing. And I'm well aware that not everything I do is fantastic. But because I do it all the time, I know that I will come back and I'll do it again and I'll try something else and I'll do it again and it will get better. And that's all that's important to me.
Mm.
So, the PSA SA, for reasons known best unto themselves, have asked me to be the opening speaker at this annual conference. And I'm like, wow, I'm terrified. But I'm going to do it, because if I don't, I'm not going to get any better. And that's what I want.
Mm. Mm.
So outside of your comfort zone is where the magic happens.
Lovely.
Right.
Lovely. And we're
We've all
so
seen,
excited to have you here for that.
it's going to be fun.
It is, and it's going to be confrontational because you've got a
Yeah.
fantastic title. Hey, expert, you know nothing. We're not going to let the cat out of the bag. But David, why should speakers be in the audience on that day?
Because as a speaker, you're aiming at a moving target. Your hot, cool, trendy topic of today is very likely not going to be hot or cool or trendy in a couple of months' time. And if you're not alert to the fact that that's going to happen, you're going to miss the cues. You're not going to be paying attention. You're not going to grow. You're not going to adapt. And this is what it's really about. It's about adopting a mindset which views all your experience as fodder for your creativity.
Mm.
And as a speaker, you're only as good as your last performance. And if your last performance is identical to the one before that, and the one before that, and the one before that, sooner or later, it's going to grind to a halt.
Mm.
And so I'm hoping to present my colleagues with an antidote to that dilemma.
Now we need to be there. Now we definitely need to be there. But in the meantime, because we still have a little bit of time while the clock is ticking down to the convention, you do have a book to keep us busy with in the meantime. Many speakers are also authors. You've got several books out. The most recent was, and I mean, this cover has to be seen to be believed. I am just going to put the link into this description of the podcast because you need to go take a look at this cover. It's already going to do half the job, but with the content of the book is about something we all need to hear, and it's about unblock writer's block. Would you like to tell us a bit about your book and why unblock writer's block, and why can you help?
Well, I don't believe that writer's block exists.
That
totally,
helps.
yeah. And so the book's written from that perspective. Of course you get stuck, but that's part of the process. And so what the book is all about is it's very short, simple little book about very practical hands-on techniques to allow anybody who is stuck to acknowledge that, own that, and move through it and use it. It really is part of the process. I don't know if you've ever done the exercise where before you go to bed, you frame a problem that you're trying to solve very clearly in your mind, and then you go to sleep. And you wake up in the morning and you've got the answer.
Mm-hmm.
In my experience, creative block's a little bit like that.
Mm.
It's a pause that your brain is forcing you to take while it figures out the next step. And if you refuse to acknowledge that and you insist on seeing it as a blockage and a personal failing and a damnation of your ambitions as a writer, and you go at it with a chisel and a hammer, you're never going to get out.
Mm-hmm.
And so Unblock Writer's Block is all about pathways and tools and methods to help you work through instead of going over.
That is beautiful. And you're reminding me of, is it Wallace's stages of the creative process? There's the preparation, incubation, illumination, and verification. But that incubation is that going to sleep at night, knowing you're stuck.
Yep.
And waiting for the answer to come, going to take a walk, going to follow Archimedes' example, get in the bath, and the eureka moment strikes.
Yeah. And there's lots of really good neurological, psychological reasons for why all that stuff works. It's not magic. It's not weirdness. It's highly predictable. Actually, it's weird.
And I love that it takes the pressure off so that there's
Yeah.
so much more openness to just your whole approach tells me that a lot of people who think they're not creative can really cut themselves some slack, have
Yeah.
some fun, and let go and be amazed at what creativity ensues. David, before we wrap up, what
Mm.
question should I be asking you?
See, now I have to come up with an answer. You see this?
I'm learning from you immediately, you see.
The question that I always seek to answer is, why is creativity so important?
Ooh, so I think we've really looked into elements of that. Is there anything about why creativity is so important that you would still like to highlight?
Well, I think it's because it is the tool with which we change the world,
Oh,
for better or for worse. And if we're unconscious of that, we end up in disempowered, unhappy, and depressed states where quite possibly that creativity manifests itself in self-destructive and negative behavior. Whereas if you acknowledge that you are creative, but you're not quite sure what's going on, you give yourself the chance to step into a different place where things can change. And that's, for me, the single most reason why it's important.
well, that is incredible. That is huge. David, it has been such a pleasure. For people who want to read your book, we've got a link. We've got your website link, your LinkedIn, and other links where people can find you and your books and your speaking. But if they want to get in touch with you to find out more, to book you, get you on the stage, what should they do?
My website's davidchislett.com. There's a contact form there. There's also a booking inquiry form you can fill in. Really easy. If you're not a big fan of that kind of stuff, hit me up on LinkedIn. Pretty easy to find there as well. Of course, you've got a podcast on Spotify, or we can search me on YouTube. I mean, yeah, I'm reachable.
You're very reachable, and we're so glad that you are. David Chislett, thank you so very much for sharing all these gems with us. We're looking forward so much to having you at the PSASA Convention 2024. And in the meantime, following you online and sharing in the gems because you share great stuff. Thank you for doing what you do.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure.
If you're enjoying learning from our guests, just imagine attending their presentations and meeting them in person. At the PSASA Convention 2024, you can do just that. The PSASA Convention is the biggest annual event hosted by the Professional Speakers Association of Southern Africa, the PSASA, a membership body which exists to support the common needs of professional speakers. During its 17-year existence, the convention has been consistently attended by an enthusiastic audience, primarily based in South Africa. It has, however, over the years also become a popular event with international speakers looking to develop their African network. PSASA 2024 is the ideal opportunity to interact with peers and spend time with decision makers in a space where creativity, innovation, and connection are at the forefront. Find the link to book your spot at the end of this episode and in the description. You've been listening to the League of Visionaries podcast, brought to you by Yazzie Media Virtual Media House. Yazzie Media is a proud media partner to the PSASA Convention 2024. All the guests on this season of the podcast will be speaking at this premier event for speakers. Book your spot at the PSASA Convention 2024 on the PSASA website at www.psaSouthernAfrica.co.za.